There is a chance that Nicaragua could actually be next up on the chopping block. And when I say that, my friends, I am not exaggerating. This is actually insanely wild. Those of you who have not seen anything about the news recently coming out of Latin America, Daniel Ortega, which is Nicaragua's more authoritarian president that has ruled the country since 2007, would go and announce that his country was going to cease holding elections to prevent the opposition from gaining power. We're not talking about something like, oh, we're going to delay elections. Oh, we're going to like some kind of issue or anything else. No, 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 no. Just, hey, we're not going to let traitors take over this country. We're going to stop all elections. And that's it. That is the end of it. Mind you, the language that I'm using there is specifically how it is that he has been framing things. The 80-year-old leader would go and declare that he would collaborate with his compliant Congress in order to be able to establish new legislation that would effectively, and I quote, build a wall against political opponents. And no, that this isn't like Trump language here. We're talking about him actually trying to block literally anything and everything that could, in any shape or form, go against him. My friends, before we continue any further with the episode, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Veracity, which actually from that, I'm going to be telling you all here a personal story. So on my Instagram here, I've actually gotten quite a number of comments that have said like, "Oh, hey, is he losing weight?" And the answer to that is yes, I am actually. I'm down about 10 pounds, and one of the reasons that that has been happening is because of this stuff. It's a natural GLP-1 booster, not like an injectable GLP, not like what people are doing for any of that. This is something that specifically just helps to suppress my hunger cues. And that is probably the biggest thing. I'll be blunt with you guys as a personal story here. When I first started dating my wife, I was 176 pounds. I was working out literally all the time because my job was a physical job hauling beer. And then when I lost that job and I started doing more stuff with, just sitting at a desk, I continued eating at the same rate that I normally do when it was that I was constantly working out. Hence the shirt. So I went from 176 pounds to over 220 in the span of like 8 years. And that was really not a good thing for me. It was actually starting to have a really negative effect here on my health, which is why I've actually seriously been trying to tackle that. And this is one of the big things that has really, really helped me. It is a natural supplement that boosts the GLPs that are already in your body. And from that, it reduces your overall hunger cues. They say on their website that they're able to, cut down by 9 pounds over the course of 90 days. Yeah, I'm down 10 pounds in like 21. It's genuinely been a huge help for me. And for anyone out there who is then having issues with their own weight, and maybe it's something that if you're not able to be as active and you have like a snacking problem or anything like I know I do, this is genuinely something that is super helpful. And I recommend that you go check out the link for it down in the description down below. Yes, they're our sponsor, but even before they were a sponsor, we actually got into this before they reached out and had ordered a 6 month subscription for myself because it's making a huge difference. Anyway, back to the show. Ortega would make these statements during a ceremony commemorating the 47th anniversary of the 1979 Sandinista Revolution, which is something that he actually helped to lead to topple Anastasio Somoza's dictatorship back at that time. This all being while his administration, jointly run with his wife and co president, Rosario Murillo, have just already over the years been systematically dismantling pretty much every democratic institution available. And so analysts view this announcement as pretty significant as an escalation towards outright one party authoritarianism. In fact, at that point, it's not even one party authoritarianism. No, no, no. It's just him and his wife being in charge. As Tiziano Breda, a senior Latin American analyst at Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, would state, quote, with this decision, Ortega and Murillo have sealed the country's transition into a full-fledged family dictatorship, end quote. And that is true. Addressing thousands of state employees, reportedly who were forced to go and attend the ceremony, Ortega would declare that, quote, there will be no more elections here so that, referring to the opposition parties, they can try to seize the government, seize power, end quote. The president, who hadn't already at this point appeared publicly for like 60 something days, would add that his government was going to work with the National Assembly and the relevant institutions on laws because we need laws that build a wall, a barrier against the coup plotters and the traitors who would sell out their country. And that's a direct quote from him. The thing is, when it is that I'm going and describing this, elections were scheduled for this next year. Ortega would provide no specifics about whether or not they would be canceled entirely or if the opposition participation would simply be barred, so it would be just like a one party election and that's it. Practice that already effectively had been implemented during the 2021 campaign when his regime would outlaw opposition parties and imprison all of his major rival presidential candidates. So, there's that. But that, my friends, is something that will have to be addressed before does we go any further because this story is wild. See, in practice, even though these statements are insane things, Ortega's announcement is way less of a substantial thing or impact than what its dramatic tone actually suggests. Like Nicaragua's opposition has already been systematically dismantled, with any viable candidates either being imprisoned or exiled from the country, and the electoral institutions have effectively been absorbed by the ruling family and can't go against them. Like they control everything. The political significance, though, of this statement, however, that is something that represents a very critical threshold. Because Ortega has shifted from merely manipulating the elections to outright rejecting the fundamental principle that power can be, something that changes hands through democratic processes. No, in this case, he is declaring it will not change. It is just something that belongs to him. Even in other countries that have flawed elections, dictatorships, they at least keep the illusion of a democratic process. He's just abandoned it altogether. Now, as for the reason why it is that I'm going into all of this development is something that could position Nicaragua as potentially being the next challenge to Trump's Latin American doctrine. Bolton's Troika, which is the term referring to the three left wing authoritarian governments in Latin America of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and that is a term that was coined by former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton back in 2018. This is something that over just the last year has already been significantly weakened. The year of 2026 would begin with a U.S. military operation that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, who at the time of, this video, when I'm making this, are currently awaiting trial in New York on charges including narcoterrorism, cocaine trafficking, and weapons violations. Meanwhile, Cuba has now engaged in direct negotiations with Washington and would announce an amnesty for over 2,000 prisoners and approve reforms that would allow for private banks, expanded private ownership, and the sale of state assets, among other things. Like, I already covered this in a previous video about a week ago or so. There's a lot of reforms that are happening in Cuba, arguably the most that have happened in decades. And so while Havana's communist regime still remains in power, technically, yes, its economic foundations are facing extraordinary pressure, as we covered in that episode a few weeks ago. And so, when describing all of this, among the three nations, Nicaragua maintains the most defiant rhetorical posture, though it is something that has received way less focus from Washington compared to Trump's first term. The country did gain more prominence after the Ortega regime's violent crackdown on protests back in 2018, which is something that prompted Trump to establish the sanctions framework that is still in use today. While at the time, at the time, Vice President Mike Pence would also accuse Nicaragua of waging war against the Catholic Church because there was a lot of anti religious sentiment that was going on at that time from the more atheistic socialist government. Essentially, the previous administration is something that framed Nicaragua primarily as the ideological adversary of democracy, of human rights, and religious freedom. It is something that oppressed anything and everything along those lines. And so now that there is a greater Monroe Doctrine political aspect to everything, which is, for those of you that remember, the combination of the Monroe Doctrine and Donald Trump because of the current administration, it is possible that Nicaragua may have just crossed a point of no return and is the next thing up on the metaphorical chopping block. But, as always, my friends, here on the History of Everything, in order to understand why this is happening, we need to first establish the context of how it is that we got here. To that end, we have to go back, not just to like 2018 or even 2007 or anything like that. No, 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 no. We need to fully understand why Nicaragua is the way that it is, and to do that, we need to go back to the previous century and even beyond. With that being said, then, let's go ahead and dive in. Now, as we begin here today, my friends, I do not want to necessarily go into too much exhausting detail about the colonial history of Nicaragua, because that is not something that is necessarily as relevant to the story, but it is still a factor in the overall story of the state today. Like the same can also be said of Cuba and Venezuela, which is why we had to go back so far for those particular videos. But in this case, we have never really covered Nicaragua at all. Like, we've never talked about it at all on this channel. So it is important that we explain more so you have a basis of understanding. So, all right then, Nicaragua. For those of you that have not really looked at a map here before of Latin America, Nicaragua is the largest country in Central America by land area. And it's something that takes its name from Nicaragua, the Nahuatl speaking chief who ruled the indigenous peoples around Lake Nicaragua when the Spanish would arrive. That's pretty much all it is that we will go into in that regard. Before European contact, the region was inhabited by a diverse array of different indigenous groups. The Pacific lowlands were home to the Nawa and the Ortega peoples with cultural ties to Mesoamerica, while the Caribbean lowlands, a wetter, more isolated region, were populated by groups such as the Miskito, the Rama, and the Sumu, whose cultures were oriented more towards South America and the Caribbean. This early geographic and cultural division between the Pacific Spanish West and the Caribbean Miskito East is something that would echo throughout all of Nicaraguan history. And that is something that, with time, would create enduring tensions that still persist to this day. So, even though, technically speaking, that is not something that is as relevant, you're going to understand later in this video why I specifically mentioned the different tribal groups. Just not exactly a spoiler, it's just some people get confused as to why I go into too much detail. You'll understand this later. So, all right, Spanish colonization begins in earnest in 1524 when Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba goes and founds the cities of Granada on Lake Nicaragua and León near Lake Managua. These two cities became rival power centers, with Granada serving as a bastion of more conservative, aristocratic, and church aligned interests, and León became the seat of liberal, anti clerical, and merchant oriented factions. Nicaragua was administered as part of the Captaincy General of Guatemala within the larger Viceroyalty of New Spain. And during the colonial period, the Pacific region was drawn into the Spanish orbit, while the Caribbean coast fell largely under British influence, with the British even establishing a protectorate over the Mosquito Kingdom and using the region for logging trade and as a buffer against any Spanish expansion. That is pretty much all it is that I'm going to say about that really early history. So we need to fast forward quite a bit now, by like 300 years. Eventually, Nicaragua would gain independence from Spain on September 15th, 1821, as part of a general Central American declaration. It briefly became part of the first Mexican Empire under Agustin de Iturbide, and then it would afterwards join the United Provinces of Central America, which was this federation that included present day Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. It's actually quite fascinating as a state that could have existed. This federation, though, was plagued by internal conflicts between liberals and conservatives, and it dissolved amid civil war around 1838. Yeah, that wasn't great, and Nicaragua would go and declare its own full independence. That is something I genuinely could do a podcast episode on, so I need to go ahead and keep that in mind. Anyway, the decades that followed were defined by a brutal and often violent rivalry between the liberal city of Leon and the more conservative city of Granada, which repeatedly would plunge the young nation into civil war or conflict. This instability would open the door to one of the most bizarre stories and consequential episodes in all of Nicaraguan history. You had the filibuster expedition of William Walker. And I have to mention this because this is the first case, really, of major foreign intervention. Basically, the way this went down was that back in the 1850s, the liberals of Leon would invite Walker, this American adventurer and soldier of fortune, a mercenary basically, to help them go and defeat their conservative rivals. Walker would come in, seize on the opportunity, and then take control of the entire country himself, declaring himself president of Nicaragua in 1856. And from that point, he did a lot of weird things. He reinstated slavery, made English an official language, and tried to align Nicaragua with the slaveholding American South. Like, this is a thing that legitimately actually happened, but it didn't go so well. His ambitions would go and unite the other Central American nations against him, and a coalition army would eventually drive him out of power. He was captured and executed by a firing squad in Honduras in 1860, and that was pretty much the end of him. But he would leave a legacy behind. Walker's episode would leave a deep and lasting suspicion of the United States and intervention in the Nicaraguan national consciousness. This is something that they would always kind of remember and not want to go through again, which actually, on that note, that is something that also would be a great podcast episode. So I need to keep that in mind too. Oh my God, this episode is perfect for so many different things I could talk about. Yeah, check out the History with Sakuyi channel for my pure history content if you don't want just like all the geopolitics that I do here. Moving on though, after Walker's defeat, conservative rule from Granada would bring a period of relative stability and economic growth that was centered more around coffee exports and plantations. This era, though, would end in 1893 when the more liberal general, Jose Santos Zelaya, would go and seize power, ushering in a modernizing dictatorship that would try to reincorporate the Caribbean Mosquito Coast into the Nicaraguan state and expand its own infrastructure, promote coffee and banana agriculture, and just in general drag Nicaragua into the modern day and age. Okay, looking at all this, you're probably wondering while looking at me, Stack, how is this relevant to what it is we're talking about with possible US intervention besides the whole thing with Walker? What does all of this have to do with the current president trying to ban elections? Well, that part comes next. See, Zelaya's independent foreign policy, especially his flirtation with allowing a Nicaraguan canal to be built with Japanese or European financing on Nicaragua's land, something that would threaten American strategic interests after the US had already chosen Panama for its own interoceanic canal, that brought him into direct conflict with Washington. In 1909, the US would support a conservative rebellion that would topple Zelaya, and from 1912 onwards, US Marines would occupy Nicaragua almost continuously for 2 decades, all to protect American financial and strategic interests. This prolonged occupation would provoke a nationalist guerrilla resistance that was led by one Augusto Cesar Sandino, who would wage a determined insurgency against American occupiers from 1927 until the Marines eventually withdrew in 1933 because, hey, there was this little thing going on called the Great Depression that kind of made it hard to pay for military expeditions. Yeah. Anyway, before departing, the United States would establish and train the Nicaraguan National Guard, a more militarized police force that was intended to maintain internal order. And its commander, this is where it gets very relevant here, was Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Why is that relevant? Well, in 1934, Somoza would go and arrange the assassination of Sandino under the guise of peace negotiations, which is something that would eliminate his most dangerous rival. Side note here, but Sandino becomes a martyr because of this and a lasting symbol of anti imperialist resistance. And so his name and legacy would later be adopted by the Sandinista movement, and that will be relevant later, so keep it in mind. That's the whole thing that I was talking about with the Sandinistas in the government today of Nicaragua. That's where it comes from. Anyway, moving on. By 1936, Somoza had seized the presidency. He founded his own family dynasty that would rule Nicaragua as a kind of personal fiefdom for more than 4 decades, and this would not go well for the country. This Somoza dynasty, being led by first Anastasio Somoza Garcia, followed by his sons Luis Somoza de Baile and Anastasio Somoza de Baile, would enrich itself enormously, controlling vast swaths of the national economy while relying on the National Guard's repression and on also steadfast support from the United States. Which, you may wonder, why would the US support them? Well, they valued the regime as a reliable anti communist ally during the Cold War. Because go figure. The dynasty's greed became especially notorious after the devastating 1972 Managua earthquake, when the Somoza family, as well as the National Guard, were widely accused of embezzling international relief aid, an act of corruption that pretty much alienated every single member of society and the business elite that had previously been more on their side, and that is something that would only broaden opposition to the regime. And mind you, by this point, there was a lot of opposition. 4 decades of pretty much naked thievery and rights violations tend to do that. Go figure. Opposition to the Somoza dictatorship would gradually coalesce around the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the FSLN, or Sandinista National Liberation Front. This being something that was founded in 1961 and named in honor of the guy that we mentioned earlier, Augusto Cesar Sandino. Drawing on Marxist and nationalist ideology, the Sandinistas would then wage a guerrilla struggle against the regime that was strengthened by a series of bad moves by the government, because it was an authoritarian dictatorship that just screwed up constantly. And the final straw would arguably be the 1978 assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, a prominent opposition newspaper editor. This is something that would galvanize nationwide outrage and unite diverse sectors of society against the Somoza family. And so, after a broad popular insurrection, the Sandinistas eventually would triumph on July 19th, 1979, this being when Anastasio Somoza Debayle would flee the country and the FSLN would enter Managua, thus changing the country forever. That was it. Now, as for who would be in charge or what would be in charge at this point, well, that is where we get to arguably the main character of this whole story that I mentioned here at the very beginning, Daniel Ortega. You see, the way this went down was that after taking power, the new Sandinista government would launch a series of ambitious social programs, including a literacy campaign, healthcare expansions, land reform, all which helped it to, become more endeared, at least initially, to much of the population. But at the same time that it did that, it also aligned itself with the Soviet Union and Cuba, which during the Cold War is something that alarmed the United States, something that you absolutely do not want to do during the Cold War. So it was then, my friends, that under President Ronald Reagan, Washington would finance, arm, and train a counter revolutionary force known as the Contras, who would wage a brutal insurgency against the Sandinista government throughout the 1980s. The resulting civil war would devastate the Nicaraguan economy and cost tens of thousands of lives. And the conflict became internationally infamous because of the Iran Contra affair, which is something that is mentioned when talking about US black operations and whatnot, and just in general screw ups. This being when the Reagan administration would secretly and illegally fund the Contras. As all of that was happening, Daniel Ortega would be elected president in 1984 in elections that most of the international community would recognize as legit, though the United States would dismiss them because, yeah, go figure, they're very hostile to him. This is not exactly a high point for the US, and of course, that is where we can definitely make some very pointed criticisms. I'm pretty sure over the course of this video, you've probably seen how much it is that I am pointing out very stupid actions that were done. With that being said, though, and I know how the comments can look when going and talking about these kinds of events, I do not want you to think that the Sandinista government of the 80s was all sunshine and roses and that it was being unfairly maligned by the United States. No, no, that is certainly not the case. That there is very little innocence here to go around. And that is something that might piss off a few people for me to say, but that is the reality. You see, the first Sandinista government of the 1980s, while yes, it was initially celebrated for overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship, they would also engage in several controversial actions that drew significant criticism and would also contribute to the severe polarization of all of Nicaraguan society. Like, first off, you just have the blatant human rights abuses and political repression that would take place. Like, the government would forcibly relocate thousands of Mosquito and Suma Indians from their traditional lands along the Atlantic coast, placing them in special zones under military control while attempting to forcibly assimilate them into Nicaraguan society. Along with that, the Sandinistas would target any and all opposition figures, not just those that were associated with the previous Somoza regime, through arrests, property confiscation, and in some cases, extrajudicial killings, with special tribunals being established to go and try former National Guard members with little to no due process at all. Like, once you were arrested and accused of something, you were basically done for. You were going to get executed. That was the end of that. Then, to control what people were saying, there was the media censorship. While initially allowing some press freedom, the government would gradually impose restrictions on independent media outlets, especially those that were, go figure, critical of Sandinista policies. Which, mind you, these were the only policies that were allowed. You may be confused when I say that. What I mean is that despite initially promising pluralism, with multi party elections, yada, 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 the Sandinistas moved towards establishing the FSLN as the dominant political force. The 1982 state of emergency would go and suspend many civil liberties and centralize power in the executive branch, which would put the state on the path to one party rule, and that was that. Oh, and remember how I told you about the goodwill that was gained from land reform? Yeah, that didn't really last long. The government's agrarian reform program, while intended to address inequality, sure, oftentimes involved expropriation of land without adequate compensation and created resentment among agricultural producers, which would then contribute to severe food shortages that only got worse with time. But Stack, you may say, that is no reason for the US to get involved. And sure, yeah, if we're just talking domestic issues here, you would absolutely have a point. You would. I'm not going to challenge that. The problem here is that it's not just domestic. because the Sandinistas provided support to leftist guerrilla movements in neighboring El Salvador, which drew the ire of the United States and other regional governments. Like, it wasn't just Nicaragua, it was all the states around them were also pretty pissed off by what was going on. This included allowing the FMLN to go and use Nicaraguan territory for logistical support, and their support for revolutionary movements and their Marxist Leninist rhetoric would create quite a number of tensions for their surrounding neighbors. They didn't like this, especially Honduras and Costa Rica, which accused Nicaragua of also interfering in their own internal affairs. So yeah, I don't want to go on and on and on about this, but this is where I need to remind people that we try to provide a complete picture on this channel. So you can argue whatever moralistic code you want in the comments. You absolutely can, and what it is you think. But reality, unfortunately, is significantly more complicated than we would commonly wish. Anyways, things were not exactly going well for Nicaragua over the course of the 1980s. The government's attempt to maintain a mixed economy while implementing socialist policies and nationalizing foreign owned businesses, especially in the mining and banking sectors, would create a lot of confusion and inefficiency. Price controls on basic goods led to shortages and a thriving black market. And along with that, the Sandinistas' decision to suspend debt payments to international lenders in the early 1980s would isolate Nicaragua from global financial institutions and thus contribute to even more economic difficulties. Like, these controversial policies and actions combined with the US backed Contra insurgency is something that would create a vicious cycle of conflict that would devastate Nicaragua's economy and result in, as I said before, tens of thousands of deaths. While the Sandinistas did implement significant social programs in literacy, healthcare, and education, like I mentioned here before, their authoritarian tendencies and human rights record would undermine the revolutionary legitimacy of the state in the eyes of many Nicaraguans as well as international observers. It wasn't something that was clean by any means. And so that, my friends, is the point where everything begins to change quite rapidly. You see, amid war weariness and economic collapse, the Sandinistas would agree to hold internationally supervised elections in 1990. And here, in a stunning upset, Ortega actually lost to Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, which, if you recognize that name, that is the widow of the slain editor Pedro Joaquin Chamorro that I mentioned earlier, and who led a broad anti Sandinista coalition. Chamorro's victory would bring an end to the Contra War and would usher in a period of democratic governance as well as market oriented economic reforms. From there, Nicaragua was governed by a series of center right or liberal presidents throughout the 1990s and heading into the early 2000s. This including Arnaldo Alman and Enrique Bolaños, while Ortega repeatedly ran for president but lost. And so there, you'd probably think that that would be the end of him, and everything for the Sandinistas in general would be over. They would never be able to take power again. But you would be wrong. And if you were not wrong, if you were actually right about that, then I probably wouldn't have a video to record right now. But that's not the case. You see, my friends, what is so fascinating about this, and this is where the most crucial detail, arguably, about this entire thing comes in. Ortega would get back power, but he ultimately engineered his return to power not through, ideological purity or general popularity or anything like that. No, 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 no. He got back into power through political maneuvering. What do I mean by that? Well, after losing three consecutive presidential elections in 1990, 1996, and 2001, Ortega recognized that the Sandinista front could not win power through normal, conventional democratic competition against a united opposition. His solution was not to broaden his own appeal to try and get more people to vote for him, but instead just change the rules of the game itself. See, beginning around 1999 and 2000, Ortega would negotiate a notorious power sharing agreement known simply as El Pacto, the Pact, with Arnaldo Alman, the corrupt liberal president who led the Constitutional Liberal Party, the PLC. What exactly did it do? Well, the pact was a mutually beneficial arrangement between the two men who, ostensibly, they were bitter ideological enemies. But it worked out well initially for both of them, because in exchange for cooperation, the two leaders would pretty much carve up control of key state institutions, like the Supreme Court, the Electoral Council, the Comptroller's Office, etc., and they would distribute these very important government seats between Sandinista and liberal loyalists in a system of institutional patronage. There was no democratic process here. I mean, these two men quite literally carved up the government. And crucially for Ortega's future, the pact would also include a constitutional change that lowered the threshold for winning the presidency in the first round of voting. What I mean by that is that previously a candidate needed to secure a substantial majority, as in the first round of voting, you had to get over 50% of the vote to win outright. Otherwise, what would happen if you had like, five people that were running for president and each one got like 15 to 20 something percent of the vote, the top two or three candidates, or I guess in this case, the top two candidates, would then move on to a second round of voting where everyone gets to vote again. And that's the way that it would work, so that there's a greater chance to choose who you want, not just who you likely think is going to win. The new rule, though, would allow a candidate to win outright with just 35% of the vote, provided that there was at least a 5 point margin over the nearest rival. So that means if one got, say, 40% or something like that of the vote, and then the remaining two got 30% each in a race between three people, that means the one who got 40%, despite having less than half the country behind them, would actually win outright just because of the divided vote. This provision is something that was tailor made for Ortega, who commanded a very loyal and very disciplined base of roughly a third of the electorate, which would be enough to win a plurality if the field became more fragmented. But never would he be able to have a majority of the country behind him if there was a unified opposition. He just had to wait for the perfect moment where the opposition was divided. This is a huge deal, but also besides that, the pact would serve to protect both men from any and all accountability. Alman, who would later be convicted of massive corruption and money laundering charges, because remember I said that this guy was pretty corrupt, he would receive a degree of political and legal protection, while Ortega would then gain the institutional footholds that he needed to secure power for himself later. This arrangement would fundamentally corrupt Nicaragua's very fragile democratic institutions and convert the nominally independent bodies and institutions into just instruments of partisan bargaining, where it was divided up between the two ideologies of the government. It was, in essence, the foundation upon which Ortega would later construct his own authoritarian regime. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. We need to talk about how he came back into power. By the 2006 presidential election, Ortega had reinvented himself dramatically. Gone was the fiery Marxist revolutionary of the 1980s who had nationalized industries and aligned with the Soviet bloc. In his place stood a more pragmatic politician who had made a series of striking accommodations that you wouldn't really expect. Like, most notably, Ortega had reconciled with the Catholic Church, which is an institution that the Sandinistas had once treated with severe hostility. He publicly would embrace Catholicism, and in a move that shocked a lot of his former more progressive allies, he supported the most restrictive abortion laws in the world, or at least one of the most restrictive abortion laws, backing a total ban on abortion, even in cases where the mother's life was at risk. Like, this just showcases how big of a jump that we're talking about here. This law was passed in 2006 with Sandinista support, as Ortega would court the church's blessing and the socially conservative vote. He was doing anything and everything he possibly could to get as many people to vote for him just to be able to get into power. Along with this, Ortega would soften his own rhetoric towards the business community and the United States, adopting themes of reconciliation, peace, Christian love, even allying with some former Contra figures. And with these extremely pragmatic moves and capitalizing on a divided opposition, what I mean is the anti Sandinista vote was split between the PLC and its own breakaway liberal movement. Ortega ended up winning the November 2006 election with just 38% of the vote, comfortably clearing the 35% threshold that his own pact had created. He was inaugurated then in January of 2007, returning to the presidency after 16 years of being out of power. So, okay, there it is. There you have it. Ortega was back. And this is the same guy that created the whole reason that we're doing this video, who just recently announced that there would be no more elections in Nicaragua at the time I'm making this in 2026. So how do we get there then? Well, it starts with his alliance with Chavez and the petro economy, which I'm going to need to explain. See, one of the defining features of Ortega's early years back in power was his very close alliance with Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Nicaragua would join the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, the ALBA, which is Chavez's regional bloc of leftist governments. And this relationship would bring an enormous influx of Venezuelan oil and financial aid, estimated at billions of dollars over the following years. Now, critically, much of this Venezuelan aid didn't flow through the national budget or anything like that, where it was publicly available. It would have been subject to legislative oversight and transparency and all that crap that, you know, a potentially authoritarian government doesn't want. No, 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 no. Instead, it went through private companies and entities that were controlled, hear me out on this, directly by the Ortega family and the Sandinista party. Huh, weird. I wonder why. This off the books petrofinancing would give Ortega a huge pool of discretionary resources that he could then use to fund social programs, to build political patronage networks, and to enrich his own family and close allies, all without any accountability whatsoever. And for a time, honestly, this wasn't necessarily so bad. This arrangement produced actual tangible results. Like Nicaragua enjoyed reasonable economic growth, poverty would decline during this time, and Ortega would fund popular social programs that would target the poor. He also maintained a pragmatic relationship with the private sector through a more corporatist model in which the government and big business and labor would negotiate policy behind closed doors. If anything, this is where they talk about corporatism that is actually related to fascism. This consensus model kept the more powerful business chamber, the COSEP, largely satisfied and because of that, politically quiet because they didn't want to rock the boat. And this is something that would buy Ortega years of relative stability and even a measure of actual genuine popularity. Not exactly a bad start. However, the details that I just shared here are extremely crucial and important. Because remember, the whole thing with running the election, he built a broad alliance with a lot of different promises about friendship and reconciliation and love, etc., etc. And also, at the same time, he was able to build up his power base specifically because of cheap Venezuelan oil. The prosperity of the entire state was built on a fragile foundation of Venezuelan patronage in the exact same way that we've covered here repeatedly with Cuba. And so, when Venezuela's own economy collapsed in the mid 2010s under Nicolas Maduro, the flow of oil would dry up, which would expose. Okay, literally, every time I'm talking about something bad happening and you have to jump up here, this is Moonbeam, everyone. My cat. She enjoys human suffering and butt scratches. Basically, what I'm saying here is that when Venezuela's own economy collapsed in the mid 2010s under Nicolas Maduro, all the aid that was coming in dried up. And this is something that exposed very severe structural weaknesses of Ortega's model of government and economy and set the stage for a severe crisis to come. But again, we are not necessarily quite there yet. First comes the dismantling of the Constitution and the gradual rigging of the entire system. You see, even as he governed rather pragmatically in the beginning, Ortega would work methodically behind the scenes to eliminate every single institutional constraint on his power. The Nicaraguan constitution is something that would prohibit both consecutive presidential reelection and more than 2 terms in office, which were provisions that should have stopped Ortega from being able to run in 2011. So, if he was president, it means that he wouldn't be able to run again for the next round. He had to wait for one other president to come in, and then he would get one more chance at being president. And after that was done, no more. That was the basic rule requirements that we're talking about here. You are hitting my microphone here, Cat. Why? Why? I know. You want to hear more about presidential corruption. I get it. Okay, fine. So, rather than respecting any of these limits on his power, Ortega instead turned to the Supreme Court that he had helped to stack through the first pack. In October of 2009, a panel of Sandinista aligned magistrates on the constitutional chamber of the Supreme Court would issue a ruling that declared the constitutional ban on reelection was a violation of Ortega's human rights, which is a very interesting way of saying that. Effectively, they would strike down the prohibition. This ruling was then procedurally dubious as well. You may wonder why. It is because opposition magistrates were reportedly not even notified of the session taking place. Their seats were instead filled by substitutes. Weird. Weird that that could happen. Yeah, but still, regardless of how it went down, it accomplished the intended purpose. It cleared a legal path for Ortega to seek re-election, which he did. And surprise, surprise, he won the 2011 election with a very large, not just 38% like he had done before, but implausibly large 62% of the vote outright. a result that the opposition and international observers would denounce as just utterly fraudulent, citing a lot of irregularities in the vote count and the partisan composition of the Electoral Council. But regardless of how that went down, it didn't really matter at this point, because with that victory, Ortega not only secured another term for himself, he also gained a supermajority for the Sandinistas in the National Assembly. He could do whatever it is that he wanted now. And so he used this legislative dominance to formally amend the Constitution in 2014, permanently abolishing term limits altogether and allowing indefinite reelection. He could just run for as long as he wanted. And would you please, for the love of God, stop scratching my furniture? We already have one guy destroying a state. I don't need you to destroy the house. Anyway, where was I? Right, the whole reform thing or constitutional change. Yeah, that 2014 reform also expanded presidential control over the military and the police, giving more power to the president, which weird, huh? That further concentrated power in Ortega's hands. Weird how that happens. In the end, it appears that Ortega had successfully played the long game, as instead of trying to rush control as he had done back in the 1980s, he let things draw themselves out and gradually took power. And this time, he was actually not alone. That brings us to the other very important character in the story that we mentioned at the beginning, his wife. See, throughout this period, Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, would steadily accumulate power and became arguably the second most powerful figure in the entire country. She was a poet, a longtime Sandinista militant, and for a while, she would serve as the government's chief spokesperson and communication strategist, delivering near daily addresses to the nation and also cultivating a public persona that would blend revolutionary socialism along with her own spirituality and Catholic mysticism, etc., etc. Like she built basically her own little cult of personality. And from there, she oversaw the government's messaging. She controlled access to the increasingly reclusive Ortega, who didn't go out in public as much, and would manage the vast patronage machinery of the state to keep the people within that state loyal to her and her husband personally. Yes, I know you get excited about corruption. I know. I know you do. You freaking fat cat. Anyway, you would probably wonder how long exactly something like this would continue, because surely, without official power, she wouldn't be able to keep this up here for long. And you would be wrong, because Murillo's ascent was something that ended up getting formalized in the 2016 election, when Ortega would name her as his vice presidential running mate. Yeah, that's right. He chose his wife to be his vice president. This move, dynastic in nature, is something that drew a lot of immediate comparisons to what he had overthrown before, the Somoza family. Like the Sandinistas had literally fought a revolution against them just for him to do the exact same thing. In fact, arguably even worse, by actually making his wife his vice president instead of just trying to raise a son to eventually take the presidency. It was very easy for critics to say that, yeah, Ortega was just building up his own family dynasty. Yeah, that's basically the end of that. The 2016 election was held under conditions that made genuine competition impossible. Months before the vote, the Supreme Court would strip the main opposition coalition of its legal leadership, which effectively would decapitate the opposition and bar its candidates from running. Like he ran pretty much unopposed. With no serious challenger, Ortega and Murillo would win in a landslide. And Murillo became vice president in January of 2017, cementing the couple's joint rule over the country. Like I swear to God, my friends, when it is that I'm describing this, it almost sounds exactly like something that my wife would want me to do. She has, and I'm not kidding when I say this, unironically asked if I would give her political power if I went into some kind of higher office. That is a conversation we have had. Anyway, as politically dubious as all of this sounds, it was about to get way worse. And that leads us to where most people talking about Nicaragua on YouTube likely start from, 2018. Because that is where everything gets really, really bad. See, the relative stability of Ortega's rule, which, yes, it is something that got more authoritarian, but it was still relatively stable during that time, this is something that would shatter very violently in April of that year. The immediate trigger was a government decree announcing cuts to Social Security benefits and increases in payroll taxes, a measure that was prompted by the fiscal issues that Nicaragua was suffering because of a decline in Venezuelan oil aid. Go figure. It's just like Cuba. When pensioners as well as students began to protest these cuts in mid April, the government responded not with words, but with immediate violence, deploying police as well as pro government paramilitary groups known as turbas or mobs to go and attack demonstrators. This heavy handed repression, rather than stopping the protest, though, is something that would ignite a nationwide explosion of anger that had been building up for years over the corruption, the electoral fraud, and the couple's increasingly dynastic authoritarian rule. Within days, these protests would transform from just a dispute over pension reform into a massive, broad based uprising, demanding that Ortega and Murillo resign. University students would occupy campuses, citizens would erect roadblocks called tranques around the country, and hundreds of thousands of people would march in the largest demonstrations that Nicaragua had seen in decades. The Catholic Church, once Ortega's ally, would attempt to mediate a national dialogue, but ultimately they ended up siding with the protesters as the death toll began to mount, which this, of course, pissed off Ortega. The government's response was ferocious and bloody. Ortega would unleash the national police alongside armed paramilitary forces in what human rights organizations would document as a systematic campaign of lethal repression. Snipers fired on crowds, paramilitaries would conduct cleanup operations to dismantle roadblocks, and security forces would carry out extrajudicial killings, torture, and mass arbitrary detentions. By the time the worst of the violence had subsided, the Inter American Commission on Human Rights and other bodies would estimate that more than 350 people had been killed, the vast majority of which were protesters and bystanders, with thousands more being wounded and imprisoned. The crackdown would trigger a mass exodus of the population, with hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguan people fleeing into exile, primarily to neighboring Costa Rica, and also they would attempt to make it to the United States, which created its own migration issue during that time. For his part in the entire affair, Ortega never really acknowledged the protests as a legitimate expression of popular discontent. Instead, he would consistently frame the 2018 uprising as a failed coup. Again, every time I'm talking about this stuff. He would refer to it as a soft coup, something that was orchestrated and financed by the United States and domestic traitors, people that were seeking to overthrow his government by force. Instead of just the force that he was using. This narrative of a foreign backed conspiracy is something that would become the central ideological justification for all the repression that would follow. And it is the same argument that continues to be invoked by him to this very day when he would finally cancel elections. And we're going to get to that here in a second. Oh yeah, by the way, my friend, speaking of things going on around the world, we are once again going to be leading several group trips here this next year that I wanted to tell you all about because, oh my God, these things are actually selling really fast and I didn't anticipate it to happen so quickly. So you might want to get on it while you can. We are taking a trip this next year to Crete in Greece, where it is that we're going to be seeing some absolutely amazing ancient palaces and going on a Jeep safari. It's going to be a bunch of fun, so I recommend that you go and check that out. And then besides that, if you're more interested in like the medieval time period, we're also going to be going to Slovenia, where it is that the whole thing is going to be like castles, lakes, and wine. It's going to be just an absolute blast. So if you want to travel with me and my wife and a whole bunch of other history nerds, I highly recommend that you go and check out these trips. You can find the link down in my description and make sure to go ahead and reach out to us if you have any questions. Oh, yeah, slight interjection, but every single time I talk about all these horrible topics in the history and around the world, there's a high chance that YouTube demonetizes me. So if you want to support my channel, if you want to get some awesome merch for yourself, definitely go and check out the stuff from my description down below and what you can see linked in like YouTube for the links there, because we actually just released a new shirt that I love, and I don't even have the sample of it right now, but it's going to be up here on the screen called Hop Latte, because it's a frog. That's a hoplite, the Greek soldier. I love these things. This is like Katana all over again. Anyway, sorry for the interruption. In the years after 2018, Ortega and Murillo would abandon pretty much any remaining pretense of democratic governance and would transform Nicaragua into a full-fledged police state. The regime would embark on a systematic campaign to eliminate every independent institution, just like my cat is trying to eliminate every chair in my house. Yeah, that's what I thought, Moonbeam. Yeah, stop. Basically, what it would do, it would just pass a series of extremely repressive laws, including foreign agent laws that would require organizations that were receiving foreign funding to register and submit to controls by the government, and a cybercrimes law that would criminalize the spread of information that the government deemed to be false. And by false, I mean just anything that disagreed with them. These laws were used as pretext to shut down all civil society en masse. Now, the scale of the crackdown was staggering. The government would cancel the legal statuses of thousands of non governmental organizations, including humanitarian groups, medical associations, universities, and religious charities, seizing their assets and property for the state. It shuttered independent newspapers, radio stations, and television channels. With actually the country's most prominent newspaper, La Prensa, they had their offices raided and occupied, and their journalists were forced into exile or sent into prison. The regime would then turn its wrath on the Catholic Church with a special vehemence, as they would expel priests and nuns, they would ban religious processions, they would imprison Bishop Rolando Alvarez, an outspoken critic of the regime, who was eventually stripped of his citizenship and then expelled to the Vatican. And mind you, he was not the only one that this happened to. As the November 2021 presidential election would approach, Ortega moved to eliminate any possibility of a competitive contest. In a sweeping wave of arrests during the mid 2021 season, the regime would go and detain essentially every credible opposition presidential candidate, along with dozens of other prominent critics, business leaders, and journalists, and former Sandinista comrades, even, who might have broken with him. Among those imprisoned were 7 potential presidential challengers, including the well known figures such as Cristiana Chamorro, who was the daughter of the former president who had defeated Ortega back in 1990. She didn't want any competition from this family now. These detentions were carried out under vague charges of conspiracy to undermine national sovereignty and treason, using the repressive laws that were enacted back in 2018 to allow the state to do pretty much whatever it wanted. With every viable opponent behind bars or in exile, Ortega, at that point, essentially ran unopposed and claimed victory with around 75% of the vote, in what the international community would overwhelmingly condemn as just a massive farce. The Organization of American States would pass a resolution declaring the election neither free, fair, nor legitimate, and the United States and European Union would refuse to recognize the results and imposed a new round of sanctions on the state. Ortega, though, it didn't matter to him. He was inaugurated for his 4th consecutive term in January of 2022. Then, in February of 2023, the regime carried out arguably one of its most extraordinary acts of repression. It released 222 political prisoners, which sounds interesting in the first place. Like, how is that oppression? Well, it released them from prison, loaded them onto a plane, and then deported them to the United States. But then also simultaneously declared them traitors to the homeland and stripped them of their Nicaraguan citizenship and confiscated their property. That's right. That this wasn't people that were U.S. foreign nationals in Nicaragua. They just stripped a bunch of their people of citizenship and then kicked them out of the country. A short time later, the government would strip the citizenship of another 94 prominent critics that were living in exile, including renowned writers such as Sergio Ramirez, who is a former Sandinista vice president and one of Latin America's most celebrated authors, along with Gioconda Belli. This action of rendering hundreds of people stateless is something that is a blatant violation of international law and underscores just how vindictive and lawless the regime had become by this point. But now, my friends, this is where we get into the real dynastic part of this whole thing. Remember how I said before that Ortega was the president and his wife was the vice president? Yeah, that was about to get worse. In early 2025, Ortega would go and institutionalize the couple's absolute power through a sweeping constitutional overhaul. The reform, which took effect in February of 2025, would formally eliminate the separation of powers, subordinating the legislative, the judicial, and the electoral branches directly to the executive. It extended the president's term from 5 to 6 years, and weirdly enough, most strikingly, it created the entirely novel office of co-president. That's right. Just like how you have like a co-emperor or something like that. You have a co-president, elevating Rosario Murillo from being the vice president to Ortega's formal equal and the co-head of state. Yeah. This reform also expanded the couple's authority over the media, would grant them direct command over a newly reorganized volunteer police, as in private secret police force, and consolidated the security apparatus under their own personal control. This document would effectively erase the last constitutional fictions of any kind of Nicaraguan democracy and legally enshrine the dynastic personalist dictatorship that had been developing over nearly 2 decades. So now, really, what is going on here is just the final step, abolishing elections altogether. The trajectory of the past 2 decades, as it is that we have gone through, would reach its logical and openly authoritarian conclusion on July 19th, 2026. As speaking in Managua Plaza at a ceremony marking the 47th anniversary of the 1979 Sandinista Revolution, the very event that had brought down the Somoza dynasty, the 80-year-old Ortega would declare that Nicaragua would no longer hold any elections, that there won't be any more elections here for them to try to seize the government and seize power, as I said before. He would announce this, declaring that the era of parties backed by the Yankees and the Somocistas returning to power was over forever. This declaration, delivered in Ortega's first public appearance in 2 months, was steeped in the exact same conspiracy rhetoric that he had used since 2018. He justified the abolition of elections by repeating his claim that the opposition only existed to serve the economic and foreign interests of the US, and he vowed to work with the National Assembly and state institutions to craft new laws that, as I said in the earlier quote, would put up a wall, a barrier against coup plotters and the traitors, end quote. He offered no actual concrete details on how a state without elections was going to, function or how leaders would be selected in the future. So that is something. Really, my friends, ultimately, the move eliminates any possibility of an electoral challenge when Ortega's current term expires the following year. And analysts widely interpret this as merely more of a symptom of the regime's deep insecurity rather than a display of strength, as though he feels like, I'm comfortable enough to be able to do this. This fear appears to be that even the most tightly controlled election could provide an opening for dissent to organize and to threaten the couple's grip on power. The declaration would also sharpen questions about succession and what was coming next, because remember, Ortega is 80 and he doesn't look too great. He has appeared visibly frail in recent appearances, struggling to walk and arriving at the anniversary event driving a car. Opposition figures in exile allege that Murillo is purging state institutions of potential rivals in preparation for the possibility of Ortega's death, positioning herself to inherit sole control of the country. With the machinery of the state fully in their hands and the last vestige of electoral democracy now formally abandoned, Nicaragua has completed a bitter historical cycle. The revolutionaries, who once overthrew a hereditary dictatorship, have, surprise, surprise, become the very thing that they sought to destroy and established a hereditary dictatorship. The question then becomes, what will happen next? At 80 years old, Ortega is increasingly absent from public life, while the 74-year-old Murillo has taken over the day-to-day business of governing. Murillo has methodically positioned herself to inherit sole power, and since 2025, anyone perceived as a threat to her or insufficiently loyal has found themselves purged from the regime. Like the clearest illustration of this ruthless consolidation is the fate of Bayardo Acre, the last surviving FSLN Revolutionary era leader who had remained loyal to Ortega. Acre was imprisoned in July of 2025 and convicted of money laundering in January of 2026. This being despite having spent years serving as the regime's chief economic advisor and building up its finances. While some Nicaraguan analysts would interpret Acre's conviction as a sacrifice designed to deflect U.S. pressure following the seizure of Maduro, the more likely explanation is that Murillo simply viewed him as a threat and wanted to eliminate him to secure her own power accordingly. Beyond Murillo, though, the succession picture points towards a broader family dynasty rather than any outside figure. Their son, Loriano Ortega Murillo, has taken on increasingly prominent political roles, and other children of the couple now occupy significant positions within the regime. This concentration of power within the immediate family is deliberate, because Ortega and Murillo have systematically eliminated every independent political and civil society actor inside of the state. Like, seriously, there just are no outsiders to deal with, even if in the event that the government is overthrown. Like, if you wanted to compare this to anything and a possible successor, the closest related country circumstance wise would be Venezuela, with Maduro. But it's difficult to envision a figure like Venezuela's Delcy Rodriguez emerging in Nicaragua. What I mean by that is that, we're talking about a capable regime insider that is outside the ruling family that could step into a leadership vacuum. That will likely not happen here precisely because Murillo has already hollowed out the inner circle of the state of anyone who might be able to rival her. Then, as for how the US will respond to all of this, or has responded to all of this, I can tell you right now that it's not positive, sure, but nothing has really happened yet at the time that I'm making this. And yeah, I know by the time this video comes out, I'm sure something more will have been said or done, but we have to work with what it is we have because I'm recording this on like what, July 21st in like first thing in the morning. Like the only thing I have seen so far is Secretary of State Marco Rubio stating that this lays bare their true authoritarian nature and that Nicaragua cannot expect business as usual with other nations while rejecting democratic rule. He would also add that Ortega and his wife have abandoned even the pretense of popular consent, and that's true. Yeah, they have. Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, in a separate statement, would urge hemispheric partners to go and join the U.S. in working to ensure the Nicaraguan people may finally choose a future free from tyranny. And that goes right back just to the sanctions that have already been a consistent tool for the U.S. government, which has been using them since 2018. As for a more forceful response, who can really say? The Venezuela operation, on the other hand, was driven in a significant part by tangible strategic prizes. By ousting Maduro, one would be able to increase oil supplies, and this would reduce prices in the US. It could curb drug trafficking, it could dislodge China, Russia, and Iran, and it could stop them from getting a strategic beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua, on the other hand, doesn't really have any comparable prize. Its most valuable extractive resource is gold, but the potential profits from Nicaraguan gold are orders of magnitude smaller than Venezuela's oil industry, let alone Venezuela's own gold reserves, making the country way less of a compelling target if you want to argue about resource desire or greed. Oh yeah, for anyone who's curious about me possibly looking a little bit different here right now, like a very sweaty. Hey, that's not me being nervous about the rest of this video or the possibility of a U.S. invasion. Hello, Moonbeam. Again, jumping on me here. I just had to stop recording this in the middle of this video to go and do a workout. Where was I? Oh yeah, Nicaragua not exactly being a good target for things. So, yeah, well, special force raids or naval blockades or other kind of acute military pressures that could be applied to things like Venezuela and Cuba. This has been done. This may appear to be the most obvious threat to Ortega and Murillo, but analysts argue that this is something that misreads the regime's actual true vulnerability. It's not likely to happen, as the couple's own conduct has actually shown over the course of the years, and especially from the 2018 crackdown. Their greatest fear has never been, oh, foreign military intervention. That's just something that is used as a political buzzword. Instead, it's the Nicaraguan people themselves massing against them that makes them nervous. This suggests that the most effective potential threat to the regime's survival lies not in external US forces, but in the possibility of renewed domestic unrest, which is itself likely part of why Ortega has now moved to limit or even stop even the tightly controlled electoral openings that could have given dissent an opportunity to reorganize. With that gone, everything goes completely underground. There's nothing out in the open. The reality is, my friends, right now, for anyone who thinks that, oh, the US is definitely going to do something immediately, with Iran flaring up again and Cuba still in a flux, Nicaragua is lower down on the priority list. Now, this does not mean that nothing is going to happen. No, 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 not like that. The US State Department in March of 2026 here would say, quote, all options are on the table, end quote, regarding Nicaragua's government, but it is simply not worth splitting heavy military resources in other directions when there are greater priorities currently. So, could something happen? Yeah, sure, it could. It actually could happen. Something likely will, though it's not likely to be directly because of the United States. It will be more than likely an internal problem, something that arises within Nicaragua. And when it does, well, you can be sure that we will be there to explain exactly when and how it came to be. With that being said, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Um, Let me know in the comment section below what other kinds of things you want us to cover next, because we have a series of things you are actually going to see on this channel. The amount of content that is going into it is rapidly going up. So if you could like, comment, subscribe, anything that helps these videos in the algorithm, we are going to try to produce as much as we possibly can to give you all more to learn about. Thank you, my friends, and I'll see you here next time. Goodbye, everyone. Moonbeam, I have to actually be able to get up here. We're not recording the next video until later.